In this video series, we'll delve into the biblical timeline of history. We aim to uncover the significance of important historical dates, such as the creation in 11,013 BC, the flood in 4990 BC, and even the date when God would bring judgment upon the house of God, the churches, as mentioned in 1 Peter 4:17. We'll also explore the date of Judgment Day, which is also alluded to in the same verse. And you might be wondering what the biblical timeline of history is and why it's important to learn. These dates weren't placed in the Bible arbitrarily. They serve a purpose beyond mere knowledge. God always has a reason for concealing truths within the Bible. These essential dates are not explicitly stated in verses, but require meticulous exploration through comparing Scripture with Scripture, the biblical method for revealing truth, mathematical analysis, and ultimately guidance from God's Holy Spirit. So what exactly is the biblical timeline of history? It's a timeline that spans across the Bible, beginning with the first book, Genesis. This timeline then extends into subsequent books and chapters. Why should we invest time in learning about the biblical timeline of history? The answer can be found in Ecclesiastes 8:5. Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. To comprehend the current time or season, understanding past biblical events is essential to understand when future events will occur that the Bible is prophesied about.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Biblical Timeline of History. This is going to be episode number 18, and it's titled Christ's Birth or Christmas. So, if you remember last time, we ended on the kings. We discovered that their line ended in 539 BC. That's when the Babylonian captivity took place. And I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll just go right back onto the timeline. All right, just a reminder, if you want to get to the timeline, go to ebiblefellowship.org. You can go to the right and you'll see the biblical timeline on the right side. You can also scroll down. It's actually on the homepage now if you haven't seen this. And it'll just give a little brief introduction on the timeline. And then you can click this blue timeline icon right here. And then this gives you the same description. So you can either hit enter or you can just scroll down and it'll be right here. And the last thing that we left off with was the kings. We went through all the kings. We got down as far as 539 BC. And if you go to the Kings tab, we'll go there real fast. This is where we ended. And just to remind people, if you click on the 460-year reign of the 43 kings, what will happen is they'll all pop out. So you can see the individual dates. Now, of course, I've explained this before. We couldn't have seen exactly how these lined up in this way. It's not easy to see that, how they overlap. That's why we created this this timeline page, which shows you how they overlap in a vertical position rather than horizontal. So if we scroll to the bottom, we got to the very end of the timeline. That's 587. That's when I think I said 539. If I did, that was by mistake. It's 587 BC. That ended the line of the kings. So if you click this, you can return to the main timeline. And then if you click this 460-year reign of the kings, you can kind of go through each of these kings and just look at the dates if you need to. And then if you want to hide it, you can just click this again and it'll hide it off the timeline. And so now we're going to move on. So 587 BC was the last date. Now, something to notice is so far on the timeline, we've been able to keep track of how old the earth is by adding up all these numbers, right? So these numbers started from the very beginning with Adam, when he bore Seth at 130. And so if you want to keep track of the math, you just have to keep adding up these numbers, 148, 130, 100, 60, 70. So we got down as far as the kings. Now, I did have a number here you can add the 480, but really you don't add the 480 because it overlaps with the kings. But essentially, the line of counting basically ends right here because we don't have like dates that continue on from here. So essentially, 587 is where the timeline ends, and as far as trying to add up dates. And so from here on out, we're going to actually be using time paths. That's where the time paths come in. And so this will often involve actually retracing back to certain events on the timeline, which will project us further onto the timeline, if that makes sense. So 587 BC ended the kings. We've learned from the Bible that there's a 70-year Great Tribulation. So 587 plus 70 years. Well, no, that's not when the tribulation began. It began in 609. 587 is the midpoint of that tribulation, which we're going to get into later. Each of these tribulations have a second point, but we'll get into this more when we talk about 1988, 1994. But if you add the 70 years to when the 70-year tribulation began, it began in 609 BC. You add the 70 years, that gets you to 539 BC. So that is when Cyrus took over the kingdom from Belteshazzar. We learn about that in Daniel. Daniel chapter. No, it's actually Daniel chapter 5. Now, if you go to Daniel 5, you'll read about Belteshazzar, how he's having a great feast. And at the end of the chapter, it says, and that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So about 62 years old, he took the kingdom. And this happened at the end of the 70-year tribulation, which typifies the Great Tribulation from 1988 to 2011. Now, that's this date right here, 539. So this is when Cyrus took over Babylon. So here it says the end of the 70-year tribulation, the Media Persian Darius Cyrus seizes Israel from Babylon. And then next on the timeline, we have the completion of the Old Testament, the Book of Esther is recorded. Now, I don't have any information to share regarding this. This is just a date that I believe Mr. Campion had on his timeline of 391 BC. I don't know if it's a secular date. So I won't go into that, but we have it here. So this is how I guess he dated the recording of the Book of Esther, which Esther would have taken place after Babylon. So we'll get into that maybe another time. So the next that's on the timeline is Christ. So this is we're going to get into that right now. Okay, so if you click on, so this is going to involve a time path because we don't have anywhere in the Bible that directly gives us a date of when Christ was born. And, this is, as you notice, when you progress on the timeline, it sometimes you'll notice that it gets more and more advanced. So it starts out a little bit easy, and then there's more work involved. So in this case, I would say it's a little more difficult trying to find Christ's birth. But we'll read about that here. So what you do is we're going to actually start in 9606, which is 1407 BC. And if you don't know what that date is, that's the date when, if you look at Moses' life, he flees Egypt, he's a shepherd in Midian, and then he's 40 years in the wilderness with the Israelites. So at the end of the 40 years, this is when they cross over Jordan. And here's like a breakdown of that right here. So this is the 40-year wilderness sojourn. And this 360-year period is started with the crossing of Jordan. And the date for that is 9606, because all you have to do is take the 9566, which will be right here, 9566. You just add 40 years, which means the crossing of Jordan happened in 9606. So that's going to be the starting point right here. And what we're going to do is, if you notice, if you click on the first 50 here, I'm going to make it so any 50 you click on will bring up this box here. So Christ's birth time path. And we're going to read Luke 2, verses 11. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And then this is Matthew 1:21. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. So when was Christ born? Earlier on the timeline, we learned that the Gregorians thought Christ was born in the year 1 AD. So they started their calendar when they thought Christ was born. To this day, we use their calendar, and we're currently in the year 2024 at the time this was written, which means they started their calendar 2024 years ago. Now, what we're going to do is just go back to this. In the beginning, we talked about this one of the very first episodes. If you click BC versus AD, this tab here, you're going to see that the Gregorians, they started their calendar right here in 1 AD, and they thought that this is when Christ was born. And so if you start here, we will end up in the year 2024, right? However, as we'll learn, Christ was actually born here in 7 BC. So they were 7 years off. And so that's the and we'll show why it's not accurate that Christ is not born here, why he's born here. So earlier in the timeline, we learned the Gregorians thought Christ was born in the year 1 AD, so they started their calendar when they thought Christ was born. To this day, we use their calendar, and we're current. Okay, so I read that. However, we've learned from the Bible that 7 BC is the date Christ had to have been born. Using a combination of time paths and secular evidence will show why we believe the Bible teaches Christ had to be born on this date. So, just move this thing out of the way. Jubilee year. We learn from the Bible that the first Jubilee began with the crossing of the Jordan in 1407 BC, or the 9,606 year of Earth's history. So this is when they the 40-year wilderness sojourn had come to an end. Mr. Camping took the date of 1407 BC and replicated 50 years 28 times, which equals 1400. So if you take 50, you times it by 28, that gives you exactly 1400 days. And that's what's shown here on the timeline is you'll see we have our first 50 here. And then if you keep replicating that 50 and you do it 28 times, you're going to land 1400 years later exactly in the year 11,006 BC. Now it's a little hard to see, but this is 8 BC. This is just 1 year prior to 7 BC. But this 28th Jubilee year ends right here. Where it ends is where Christ's birth begins, 7 BC. So 50 years, 28 times. So if you count these, there's 28 of them, which lands you on 7 BC, or the 11,006th year of Earth's history, as you'll see on the timeline here. Okay, so getting into the secular evidence. Recent history has shown to be accurate when lined up with the biblical timeline when it comes to dates like Solomon's death in 931 BC, or Jehu beginning to reign in 841 BC, as well as other kings. And we saw on the timeline, we go back to the king's timeline. So we saw that in 931 BC, this is when Solomon died, 931. If you look up on Google, when did Solomon die? You'll see it places, if you just click on Wikipedia, it places him at 931 BC. The death of Solomon and the division of his kingdom would have occurred in the fall of 931 BC. Now, this is just secular evidence. They did not get this from the Bible. which means that but it happens to line up with the Bible. So, as you go through more recent history, it seems to be more accurate. Not that we trust the secular evidence, but when you find it lines up with the Bible, then it helps to confirm, it adds more to it. And then the same thing could be said with Jehu. He began to reign in, and none of this was gathered from secular evidence. This was placed on the timeline, going through the biblical timeline of history. So Jehu began to reign in 841. So if we type in, when did Jehu king reign? They place him in 842, the date of 841 to 814 BCE. Now we just say BC for before Christ. You see on the timeline 841. So you'll see that, and there's more too that we won't get into now, but there are dates that line up. So yeah, so like Solomon's death in 931 BC, or when Jehu began to reign in 841 BC, as well as other kings. So let's take a look at the following verses. Give me one moment. Hey, Brian, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I got Brian here. He was a little bit delayed, but he's in the room. All right, so let's take a look at the following verses. Matthew 2, verses 1. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. Verse 3. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Verses 7. Then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Verse 12. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. In verse 13. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. In verse 15, and was there unto the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. The baby Jesus was taken to Egypt until the death of Herod. This is an excerpt from secular history. Herod the Great began to rule in Judea in 37 BCE. He was appointed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 40 BCE, but he did not secure his kingdom until 37 BCE after taking Jerusalem. Herod's reign lasted until the death in 4 BCE. Now, we don't use BCE because secular history uses before common era. We say before Christ, but it means the same thing. So secular history places Herod's death at 4 BC, which is the 11,009th year of Earth's history. So if we go in the timeline, Christ is born in 11,006, 789. So 3 years later is where secular history is placing Herod's death. This is just 3 years after Jesus was born, which fits with the Bible. This would align with Jesus being born prior to Herod's death, which means 1 AD is not in alignment. Then Herod would have been dead before Jesus was born. So if Jesus was born in 1 AD, and this piece of secular evidence is saying he died in 4 BC, then Jesus would have been born, what is that, 4 years later in 1 AD, and it just doesn't make sense with the Bible because Herod was alive before Jesus was born. So if you follow the Gregorian calendar and say it's 1 AD, Herod would have already died, a few years later prior to that. And so it wouldn't match with the Bible, right? It's close, but it's not it's off, by 7 years. So, all right. So here's some more proofs. 1,000-year events number pattern. So other proofs. One thing I didn't read was the verse about the Jubilee, because kind of skipped ahead a little bit here. So some may be wondering, why did we start here when the crossing of Jordan? So I figured we could read that verse. Brian, do you happen to know which passage that was?
Leviticus.
Leviticus 25. Would you mind reading some of that?
Sure.
Verses, maybe 1 through 10.
Sure. And Jehovah spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye come into the land which I give you, can you make it a little smaller? Let me just move my photo.
Is this better?
Speak, yeah. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto Jehovah. 6 years shalt thou sow in thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall a Sabbath of rest but in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for Jehovah. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thine vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed, for it is a year of rest unto the land. And the Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you, for thee and for thy servant, and for thy maid, and for thy hired servant, and for thy stranger that sojourneth with thee, and for thy cattle, and for thy beasts that are in thy land, shall all the increase thereof be meat. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of 7 Sabbaths shall be unto thee 49 years. Then thou shalt cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the day of atonement. Ye shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land, and ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. A jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. Ye shall not sow, neither reap that which groweth of itself in it, nor gather the grapes in it of thy vine undressed. For it is the Jubilee, it shall be holy unto you. Ye shall eat the increase thereof out of the field.
Okay. Yeah, so as we see here, a Jubilee in verse 11, a Jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. So every 50 years now, if you take 7 times 7, that's 49, right?
And it even says 49 years in one of the verses. Yeah.
Yeah, 7 times 7 years, that gives you 49. And in the space of the 7 Sabbaths of the year shall be unto thee 49 years. But it's that 50th year where you're proclaiming liberty throughout all the land. And it's very fitting for Christ to be born on a Jubilee year, because he set the captives free, right? He came to demonstrate what he did at the foundation of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So this is when the Jubilee began. You could say, right? The crossing over Jordan, you add 50 years, and then you keep doing that. Every 50 years is a new Jubilee, right? So eventually, once you get to the time of around when Christ was born, because secular evidence does show Herod being born around 4 BC.
No, dying at 4 BC.
Yeah, him dying, sorry.
Dying in April of 4 BC, if I recall correctly.
Yep. And so that means that it's close to this time, and And for Christ to land exactly on 11,006 is significant, and we'll go into that more in just a bit.
One other thing, just a quick mention, it says the Day of Jubilee, which it also says is the Day of Atonement. That's what modern day Jews call Yom Kippur, and it's the highest holy day of the Jewish religion. So if you're ever wondering when it is, if you look on the calendar where it says Yom Kippur, that's the 10th day of the 7th month. That's the Day of Atonement. And in a Jubilee year, which we probably won't have anymore, if the world ends in 2033, we won't have any more Jubilee years, but that would also be the day of Jubilee.
Yeah, so 1994 was that last Jubilee year. Yeah. Which is very fitting. Yeah. We'll go back here. So 1,000-year events number pattern. So this is the second piece of information. So other proofs are number patterns or other time paths that take us to the year 7 BC or 11,006 or the 11,006 year of Earth's history. We've learned from the Bible and the timeline found within the Bible that God often uses number patterns. We've learned the following. Jacob is born in 9,006. So this is the 9,006th year of how old the Earth is. And then the BC date is 2007 BC. 1,000 years later, in 10,006, David is anointed king, and that happened in 1007 BC. 11,006 is when, which also is what this Jubilee, 28 Jubilees land on. Christ is born when the earth reached the age of 7 BC, right? Mm-hmm. So you can see the number pattern here, 9,006, 10,006, 11,006. So every 1,000 years is a very significant event. However, because the New Testament era comes into play, and God had sealed up his word until the time of the end, we skip the 12,000th year and we go right to the 13,000th year. So these were 1,000-year increments. Now we're jumping 2,000 years into the future, and that's when we land on 13,006, which is the official end of the church age, the latter rain, 1994 AD, which we're going to get into later. So just to show you on the timeline, these dates, we go up to Jacob. We're going to see that Jacob's born in, so here's Jacob's beginning. He's born in 9,006 or 2007 BC. And if we go down 1,000 years later, during the time of the kings, we'll see that King David begins to reign in 10,006. And you have the interesting numbers here of 7 and 33, which makes up 40 years. This is matches Christ's. He was born in 7 BC, so 7 years later, we get to 33 AD. It was a very similar number pattern.
And the reason for the 7 and 33 is because David reigned for 7 years in Hebron, and Saul's servants fought against him. So for those 7 years, or actually 7 years and 6 months, he was ruler of only Judah. And then for those latter 33 years, he was ruler of all 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah. And we went into that before, but it's interesting to see, it kind of helps to see these two numbers. You have 7 and you have 33. That's how God divides up his reign. Well, if you look down near Christ, 1,000 years later, we have a similar number pattern. You have 7 BC and you have 33 AD. That's when Christ was crucified. So if you add 7 plus 33, you get about roughly just about 40 years, a little under 40. Mm-hmm.
One thing that's interesting too is 7 BC is the year that Christ was born, but it's not the year David was born. It was the year he became king.
Right.
And he became king at the age of 30 years old. But what makes it interesting is David became king in 1007 BC. But when Christ is being questioned, I think it's by Pilate, And he said, "Are you a king?" And he said, "To this end was I born." So Christ was king of the Jews, meaning the elect, spiritual Jews, from the day he was born. So even though it's not tied to David's birth, it's tied to when David became king. And 1,000 years later is Christ's birth, but that's also the year that he became king because he was born king.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that would also fit in with Matthew 2 verses 2. It says, saying, where, so this is when the wise men inquired of let's see, this is Herod. Herod was inquiring of the king. He said, saying, "Where is he that is born king of the Jews?" So he's born a king. He's being called king of the Jews even from his birth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, these are the wise men inquiring of where I said Herod. Then later Herod asked, because he was troubled by it. So it's a very, very, very fitting pattern for David to begin reigning, and then 1,000 years later, for Christ to come as a king, essentially. So now we'll get into the time paths here. So,
Well, one thing that's kind of interesting about the wise men is when you read that account, it talks about them. Can we go back to Matthew 2 and verse 11?
yeah, Matthew 2:11. Can we read it?
Yeah, can you read verses 11 and 12?
And when they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way.
Now, if you look at the word young child, it's G3813, but it's not the word babe, which is G1025. Now, in the Matthew account, it talks about the Magi, the three wise men. However, the word babe only appears in the Luke account. It appears in Luke 141.
Isn't that? Second. And it came to pass that when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, the babe leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Ghost.
And of course, this would be a reference to John the Baptist, who was a babe in the womb. And verse 44.
For lo, as soon as the voice of thy salutation sounded in mine ears, the babe leaped in my womb for joy.
And Luke 2:12.
And this shall be a sign unto you: you shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger.
And verse 16.
And they came with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger.
And in all these cases, the word translated babe is G1025. Now, if you go back to verse 17,
Luke 2:17.
yes.
And when they had seen it, they made known abroad the saying which was told them concerning this child.
And this word child is G3813. That's the same word translated young child in the Matthew account. And in the Luke account, where it uses the word babe, it never talks about the Magi, about the three wise men, only about the shepherds and the angels. And if you go back to Matthew, again, Matthew 2:11 and 12, it says, and when they were come into the house, doesn't say the stable. When they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And again, this is a different word than the word babe. So this leads me to think that and remember, the wise men traveled a great distance from the east, and they consulted Herod. So this causes me to think that there was probably some time that passed after Christmas, because I don't think they were still in the stable, because it's not because the stable is not a house, and also it uses the word young child as opposed to babe. So perhaps, and I'm not saying this definitively, but I'm just saying it's interesting. It seems like maybe the three wise men came later. They weren't there at the Christmas. I know traditionally you see the wise men in the nativity scene, but that might not be historically accurate.
That's interesting. Yeah, never thought about that. So we'll go ahead and pick up with where we left off at the now we're going to be looking into time paths. So we went into the Jubilee years. We went into the number pattern, seeing every 1,000 years, and it lands on 11,006.
Oh, there was another number pattern that Mr. Camping brought up that doesn't appear there, and he talked about the Exodus occurred in the year 1447 BC.
Yeah, we're gonna get into.
Oh, you're getting into that later? Okay.
Well, I think I think we're talking about the same thing.
Okay.
So we also have a very interesting time path starting from Moses' birth in 1527 BC. So Moses was born up here, 1527, 9486. So we're going to be starting here. Moses' lifespan is 120 years, as we've learned earlier on the timeline. That's right here. In the Bible, God breaks up Moses' lifespan of 120 into 3 parts of 40. So, we didn't do this. God gives us the 120, and he also lets us know that Moses' lifespan is made up of 3 sets of 40. So you can break down 120 into 340s. And this is a good example of God showing us about breaking down numbers. So you could do 40 plus 40 plus 40 equals 120. And interesting enough, if you take the 120 of Moses's life, you times it by 4, so that's 120 plus 120 plus 120 plus 120, that equals a total of 480. Well, what does that remind you of? There's a 480-year period from the time of the Exodus to when Solomon laid the foundation of the temple. So this 480-year period, it doesn't start when Moses is born. Moses is born earlier, right? But if you stretch out his life 4 times, it also equals 480 years, which I thought was interesting. So which means that this 480-year period is actually made up of all 40s, right? Which makes a lot of sense. I know we pointed out here, let me just close out of this for a second. We already pointed out that it started with the 40 and it ended with 2 40s. But I don't know if Mr. Camping ever talked about that it's actually made up of all 40s, the 360 as well. And it makes sense because you have a 40 here, 80 is 2 40s, you have another 40, you have another 40. These add up to 40. So eventually when you get to the end of the 360, so if you take 360 divided by 40, it's 9 40s. You got 140 plus the 9 40s, it's 10 40s, 11, 12. So 480 is made up of 12 40s. 40 times 12, 480. So you got a lot of 40s, and it starts with Moses. So God's really highlighting the number for testing in this whole period and also here. Now, I think what God could be teaching here is that we should extend the 40 years out. So we start here, 40, 40, 40. This would include this 40. You go another 40. Keep going all the way through all these 40s, which are made up of 9 40s. You got another 40 here and another 40 here. And this actually takes you to the reign of King David. This 40-year period. It was King Saul and then King David reigned right here. We went over that before. But we're going to get into that in just a second right here.
Yeah, one thing just struck me that if you go back up to all those 40s,
yeah,
that first 40 to the left, that's the 40-year wilderness sojourn. But you could make an argument because when Moses killed the Egyptian, he said, who made thou a judge over us? And so you could argue that Moses was the first judge, and that judge's period would have began when he fled Egypt, which would add another 40 to that. And so it would actually be 1340s. So it would be the 40 years from when Moses was in exile from Egypt, and the second 40 would be the 40 years in the wilderness. And then you had the 360-year judges period, and then which is 9, and then the 40 years of Saul and the 40 years of David, at the end of which the temple was laid. That would actually be 1330s from when Moses killed the Egyptian.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. You include each of these 40s. You start with Moses, and that's what we're going to get into. Is Moses is the starting point for the first 40. You have the second 40, the third 40, and it just seems like God's really highlighting all these 40s here. And I don't think he's doing this by coincidence, because you're going to find something very, very interesting in just a moment. We're going to pull it up here. But if we count all these, you got 1, 2, 3. This one counts as the third one still. It's the same period of time. And then you have the 9 that we calculated here. There's the 360. 40 times 9 is made up of 360. So you got 1, 2, 3. And then you add the 9. That's 10, 11, 12. 13, 14. So this whole time period from here to when Solomon laid the foundation of the temple is 9, 10, 11, 12, 14 40s, right? A lot of 40s there. But if we continue, if we don't just stop here at the 14th 40 and you keep adding more 40s, you're going to see what happens, right? So let's go back down here. So I think we left right here. So we have a very interesting time path starting from Moses' birth in 1527 BC, or 9486 EA, Earth's age. Moses' lifespan is 120 years, as we've learned earlier in the timeline. In the Bible, God breaks up Moses' lifespan of 120 into 3 parts of 40. You have 40 years raised in Egypt, 40 years as a shepherd unto the Exodus, and 40 years sojourn in the wilderness, which means we start from Moses' birth year, 1527, and keep replicating the 40 years, which we find lands on very significant dates, one of which is the 11,006th year, or 7 BC. So if we start from Moses' date, we plus the 40, and we're timesing that 40 38 times. You do that, that lands exactly in 7 BC. So we can do that on the calculator here. So Moses' birth plus the 40 times 38 lands you in -7, which is 7 BC. And that equates to the 11,006th year. So again, not only from Jacob to King David to Christ, they're 1,000 years after King David's reign lands you on Christ, but so does, it's made up of 38 40-year periods, right? And then if you add another 40, that takes you to Christ's death in 33 AD, which we'll talk about that later. So we're going to see Christ's birth, and then one more 40 leads to his death. Now, if you keep replicating the 40s now, and you'll notice we added a 1 here, right here. So it's 40 times 39 plus 1. Why did we add the 1? Well, when you're crossing over from BC to AD, you have to account for the no year 0. So let me go back here for a second. So we talked about that here. The Gregorians didn't add a year 0. They just started off the year as year 1, which you don't start off a year at year 1 because the year hasn't passed yet. It's year 1 once it's passed, a whole year has passed. So we have to add that extra 0 year that's missing in order for it to be accurate. So that's why we add the +1, because we're crossing over from 7 BC, right? We're crossing over from 1527 BC, and we're taking the 40s 39 times, and that gets us to 33 AD, but we have to add that 0. We have to account for that, right? So you do that, that lands you in 33 AD, or the 11,046th year of its history, right? Which, depending on the count, it can be 34 AD or 33 AD. You can count inclusive versus non-inclusive. Now, if you take the same date of 1527 plus the 40, and this time you do 88, count for the 1 because we're crossing over from BC to AD, that lands you in 1994, which is the 13,006th year of Earth's history. Why is that significant? You have 11,006, you have 13,006. If you do 1527 plus 40 times 89 plus 1, so that's 40 years later, you land on 2033, which is a 13,046 year. So if you just look at this number pattern, 11,006, 13,006, 11,046, 13,046. And so Moses's life really takes you to Christ's first coming, which is this is his birth, and this is Christ's death. But Moses's time path also takes you to Christ's second coming, which is 1994, 13,006, and it also takes you to 2033, which is 13,046. So it takes you to both Christ's first coming and his second coming, which makes it a very interesting time path. And that's what we put here. What we find is Moses's life, when broken down into 40s, takes us to Christ's birth and death for his first coming, but also takes us to Christ's second coming in judgment, to the dates of the latter rain in 1994 and the end of the world in 2033. And that's what the biblical evidence is leading us to. So it's a very, very interesting time path. And perhaps now we could see why God has highlighted so many different 40s here. You know, I mean, I just thought it was with Moses's life. I didn't realize, and I did notice these 40s here, but I never noticed that the 360 is also made up of a whole bunch of 40s. And that would explain the judges period, because you hear 40 a lot. The land had rest for 40 years, for 80 years, so on and so forth. So that's pretty much it for the time path that leads us to Christ's birth, which is the 11,006th year, 7 BC. And maybe Brian can touch upon this, but you know, it wasn't quite a full 39 years, but 38.5. Which is essentially almost 39 years, but it does land us in this key date of 11,006 or 7 BC. And his lifespan ends in 11,045, which is 33 AD. That's the important part. Do you want to add anything to that, Brian?
Well, going back where you had the year 11,046 and 13,046, the reason that you're adding 1 is because it's inclusive years. You're including the year of Moses' birth, where with the other timelines you aren't including the years of Moses' birth. And for the year 11,046 and 13,046, that's the non-accession Earth age, whereas normally we talk in the accession Earth age. So, for example, we say the flood was in 6,023. That's the accession Earth age, whereas 6,024 would be the non-accession Earth age at the time of the flood. And so too, 13,046 would be the non-accession Earth age at the time of the cross, and 11,045 would be the accession age of the Earth at the time of the cross.
Okay. Yeah, so just to add to what Brian is saying, we went through accession versus non-accession. It's the difference between counting, for example, if you're counting a week and you're on Sunday, 7 days later, you end up on Sunday, but you don't count the day you're on. You start with Monday. So you don't count. So in this case, you're not counting the year that you're on. Like Brian just mentioned, 6,023 or 4990 BC. You're not counting that year, you're counting the following year. That's how calculators work. Is they don't count the current number you're on, right? If you do 6,023 plus 7,023, that gives you 13,046, right? But calculators don't count this year. They actually start with 6,024, right? 6,025, 6,026, and then you land up in 7,023. So they're essentially not counting this year. There's this day, they're skipping. They're going to the next one. However, another way to count would be to count that day. So in this case, if we count 6,023, you're adding the 1 to include because the calculator doesn't calculate it like that. So, when you account for the 1, when you count this, so one way to do it is just 6,022, right? And that accounts for that. The calculator will count, okay, 6,023. It'll start to count there. 6,024, 6,025. Then you'll end up in 7,023, and that gives you exactly 13,045 years. So that's how we get to that date, which is 2033. So when we get to 2033, it's because we're counting that current year rather than skipping it and counting the next year. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, whether you want to say accession versus non-accession, in his later years can't be used inclusive versus non-inclusive. Today, Chris likes the terms calendar versus actual. It's just different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah. And we do have there are other time paths that lead to 11,000, the 11,000th and 6th year of Earth's history. I don't think we really have time to get into that, but
well, there is one I can just say real quickly.
Sure.
Camping pointed this out, and for example, time has an end. The Exodus was in the year 1447 BC, 9566 EA, which would be a difference of 1,440 years, and 1440 breaks down to 10 times 12 times 12. 10 completeness times 12 fullness times 12 fullness.
So if we go from the Exodus to what date?
To 7 BC. So the Exodus was in 1447,
right,
BC. Christmas was in 7 BC, which leaves a difference of 1440 years.
Let's see, 1447 plus that, but it leaves a difference of how many years?
Well, just add 7.
Oh, 1440. Okay. So you're taking the 1440 from this date.
Yeah, 1447 BC minus 7 BC is a difference of 1,440 years. And 1,440 breaks down to 10, which is completeness, times 12 fullness times 12 fullness again. So it's completeness times fullness doubled.
Yeah, so this was actually the same type of time path if you think about it. If you start at the Exodus and you go 40 years, so 47 plus 40 years times, and you do that 36 times, so it's 36 40s. It's made up of 36 40s that also crosses that path of Christ's birth. And I think we just went over that. So it's we're basically said the same thing, Brian, with the 40s.
Yeah.
You just added up all the numbers. So let me go back here. And then we'll get that question from Candace. She's got her hand raised. Oh, for some reason, this doesn't want to open. Do it here. Oh, it froze. That's why. Okay. So we did 40 years with Moses's. Yeah, so 40 times 38. So if you're going from the Jubilee year, so what Brian's doing is he's going 40 years back when the Exodus happened. This was when Moses is born. So 80 years later, 1527 plus 80 gives you the date of 1447. So Brian is going 80 years ahead of Moses's lifespan. That's the Exodus, and taking that number, which again, it breaks down to 40 times 36. So it's another way to get to Christ with the 40s, but it's times 36. So, okay, let's question from Candace.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Mhm.
Okay, so somebody had asked me to ask this question, so I'm going to try to frame it as best as I can. 1994. Okay, so that was 40 times 88, right? Minus, it's plus one, but it's minus one for the year because there's no year zero, right? Is that how 19?
Wait. Say that again.
So how we came to 1994, okay? That was 40 times 88, right?
If you're
48 times
starting,
88,
that's if you're starting from Moses.
right, from Moses, right? So if you're starting from Moses, right? And 40 is, of course, like the year of, it's a year for testing, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
if that's the case, would, and I'm trying to reframe this person's question, if that's the case, so the official judgment on the church, we always say that the official judgment on the church it began in 1988, right? Or I'm sorry,
No,
in
it began in 1994.
19, right.
Right.
It was, but so 1994, so it wasn't 88. So from it actually started, the judgment actually started or fell on the church in 1994,
Well, 1988 is when the judgment began.
right?
I think the reason why we say 1994 is because that starts the 40-year pattern. So just like Christ was born in 7 BC and he dies in 33 AD, that started
Yeah.
that 40-year pattern.
Mhm.
And the 40-year pattern doesn't start with 1988. Somebody tried to do that. They tried to take 1988 and add 40 to it, and you end up in 2028. And they try to use that as a period of 40-year testing. But that's why it's the official. I believe that's why it's called the official beginning of the church age, because it starts that 40-year period, which would tie in with the 40 stripes. 1988 would be 46. It wouldn't be 40. And also because 1994 began the latter rain, right? And so it's not that Satan wasn't ruling in the churches in 1988, and that's when the great God's Spirit was being poured out in the
Right.
world.
Okay, so it was the official rule. Doesn't really. It was 1994. It was
Right.
not.
It doesn't mean that judgment wasn't upon them. As far as how the stripes, did the stripes begin in 1994? I don't know how that works.
Well, think about it this way. Let's say like God likens, people to his children. Okay. Let's say that you have two children, okay, and they both act up, and both of them say, "You're grounded." So, in a sense, they're both being punished. But if at one point you say to the one child, "You're still grounded," and to the other child, "You're not grounded anymore." So, in a sense, the one child was punished from the time they were grounded, but they were also more punished because they're being punished while the other child isn't.
Right.
And likewise, salvation was not possible. It was not possible at all from 1988 on.
Right.
And it was virtually not happening in the world. So it was like they were both being grounded at the same time.
Right.
Whereas in 1994, there was still absolutely no salvation in the churches, but there was a great many being saved out in the world.
Outside of the churches, right.
And so the punishment was lifted off of the world, but it stayed on the churches. And that was God's way of showing that is a permanent punishment. Like God's not coming back to the churches.
So I think that was her question, was when did the actual judgment upon the churches start? Was it 1988 or was it 1994? But it actually started in 1988.
Right. Yeah, and one thing that may help is if you look at Christ's pattern, Christ was born, we just went over this, in 11,006.
Right.
He wasn't born in 11,000, but you could say that 11,000th year marked the beginning of an era, right? Like in 11,005, Christ's birth is announced in 8 BC. That would have been a year prior. And I would say the 11,000th year is significant, because it's a big marker. But Christ wasn't born until 11,006, and so that's when that timeline began. So maybe likewise with 13,006, which would be 1994. That was the Jubilee year, just like when Christ was born, and it began that 40-year period. So, I
The
think
person said they got it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I said to tell you.
I guess we'll take one last question, and then we'll have to go to our next program.
Hey, guy, wonderful work as usual. My question is, so we've never considered in any of this dating the whole fig leaf, Israel becoming a state, when God says that's the door. So I don't know. I've never looked it up if it's a door or a gate. I mean, that's just a big thing, isn't it? Seems like gigantic thing, this Israel becoming a state. And I don't know.
Yeah, it was.
Thank you.
It was definitely a biblical time period, because in the Bible, it says in let me pull it up.
Matthew 24:32.
Yeah. 24 verse 32. Now learn a parable of a fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. And if you can compare that real fast with when God curses the fig tree, which is relating to the churches, but also to Israel. It can mean both. Jesus answered and said unto them, verily I say unto you, if you have faith and doubt not, you shall not only do this which is done to the fig tree, but also if thou so that's talking about the churches, but the churches can also be Israel. So when it says not learn a parable of a fig tree, it's not talking about the churches. It's talking about Israel, the nation. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh, so that we're close to the end. I think Mr. Camping talked a little bit about the fact that 1948 plus 40 years gets you to 1988. So there was like a 40-year period, and I think he kind of reasoned that God was maybe giving Israel one last period of time to repent, but it's the Bible doesn't specifically mention 1948, and I don't know if we find any time paths to 1948. That's another thing too. Maybe there are.
There are definitely time paths. I could be wrong on this. I'm like 85% sure that this is accurate, but I believe that one of the time paths that Mr. Camping talked about leading up to May 21 is if you count the number of days from when Israel became a nation in 1948 to May 21, 2011, I believe it was 23,017 days. So big 23, which represents judgment, little 17, which represents heaven. Because we know that a remnant of the earth was saved. So, on May 21, most of the world was under judgment, but there was a small remnant that was saved on or before May 21.
Yeah, and Brian is right. There is a time path. If Moses' time path, or the one we just went over, takes you to 1988, well, that time path is every 40 years. So if it goes well, no, that one actually goes from 1994. So never mind, scratch that.
Yeah, but when it says when the fig tree, summer is not. Summer has to do with harvest, and harvest has to do with the end of the world. So that was sort of an outward sign that we could see. So like everybody knew the world's not going to end until Israel comes back into existence. Just like today, we know that the second coming of Christ is likened to both Noah and Lot. And Noah, of course, is famous for the flood. And after the flood, God gave the rainbow as a token. And also Lot, he was famously in Sodom, which has to do with homosexuality. And it turns out that the homosexuality movement of today uses a rainbow flag as their symbol. So it seems to be tying Noah and Lot to this time period.
Yeah. But we do have to close out because we're already a few minutes past into the next segment. So thanks again. And God willing, we'll be back next Sunday to pick up where we left off.